Hello, everybody. Noswaith dda, chroeso I bawb. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our annual Hayden Ellis lecture. It's a really great pleasure this evening to be able to introduce Shami Chakrabarti. I'm sure she is a very familiar figure to you on your TV screens. You're aware that she's the Director of Liberty and has been for a number of years. She became director, I'm sure you'll hear about this actually a little bit later, the day before the 9/11 attacks, which was really pitched straight into the middle of things. And she's, as you know, has been a fantastic advocate for human rights and civil rights ever since that time, through some of the most challenging years that we've had in the UK in recent history on those matters, and we're certainly still engaging with them now. She's going to talk to us about the topic of her lecture is on liberty, and there'll be an opportunity after the lecture to ask questions, so please do store up some questions. Let's have plenty of hands, and I will chair the question and answer session afterwards. So, ladies and gentlemen, please, a big welcome for Shami Chakrabarti.
Well, thank you very much. It's a daunting privilege to be here at a great Welsh university, and in particular to give this lecture in Professor Ellis's name. And I know that there are members of the family here this evening. Be afraid, though. Be just a little bit afraid, because what the very dynamic and perhaps overly kind and polite Vice-Chancellor didn't mention is, as my publishers proudly post on the back of the book that goes with this lecture, that's called On Liberty. What he didn't point out was that a great newspaper that you may or may not be familiar with, called The Sun, once called me the most dangerous woman in Britain. Only in Britain, I hear you are. And you've already heard, of course, that that I've had this very strange accidental career. I came to Liberty from Mordor, or the Dark Tower, or the Home Office, the day before that atrocity in New York that seemed to change so much. So if not the most dangerous woman in Britain, I seem to be a bit of a Jonah, because we published this book, which is essentially an argument for preserving human rights and saving the Human Rights Act, and not descending into nationalism and xenophobia at this very, very tricky moment in global history. We published this book the day before the Lord Chancellor, Mr. Grayling, published his party's plans to scrap the Human Rights Act. So either I know something you don't know, or I am, I'm not dangerous, but I have this this Jonah effect. And I can see some people just squirming in their seats. It'll be all right. It's done in an hour, and then it's absolutely fine. But it's also a daunting privilege to be clashing. This is what a great university you have here. I am clashing this evening with the Baroness Hale of Richmond, Brenda Hale, who is speaking here right now to the law faculty. And you'll know, of course, that she is the first and only woman in our Supreme Court. And I say that with some pride, because I consider her a friend and a mentor, and with some shame, because this is the United Kingdom in 2014. But anyway, I do think it's a great testament to the University of Cardiff that you've got all of these ideas going on, and all of these people who want to come and speak and feel that they might get a fair hearing in audiences, with audiences like this. And I hope to not hog the whole time, so that we can, at the end of our time together, have some questions and comments, and my favourite, actually, which are comments dressed up as questions. And you know the way to do that, don't you? You raise your voice at the end of the sentence. in the way that the French or Australians do. So we can do that a little bit in a moment. As you've heard, I'm the Director of Liberty, formerly and otherwise known as the National Council for Civil Liberties. And we are 80 this year. It's the power of Botox, ladies and gentlemen. We are 80 this year, which means, if you do the maths, we were formed in 1934. 1934, 2014. 2 years that couldn't be more different, I hear you think, particularly some of the younger members of this audience. What could those dates possibly have in common? In 1934, we don't really have TV, let alone reality TV or CCTV. In 1934, we have no internet. We haven't discovered DNA. In 1934, there was so much that was different. We hadn't had World War II. We hadn't had the beginnings of the international human rights movement, of which I'm now a small and privileged part. And yet, in 1934, certain newspapers that are still in existence regularly ran headlines about how terrible it was that refugees were coming to the United Kingdom from Eastern Europe in particular. 1934, you'll know, a time of great economic uncertainty and real anguish for a lot of people. And the particular trigger for the foundation of my movement, which is a membership organisation. I have to plug that, or my colleagues will go and look at this talk online later and get very cross with me for not saying it's a membership organisation. So now we've done the book and we've done the membership, and we can chat. But the particular trigger for the formation of the National Council for Civil Liberties was that hunger marchers, you'll remember, had come from the north of England to assemble in Hyde Park in London. And when they did that, they were promptly duffed up by the Metropolitan Police. Sorry, that's a jurisprudential term. The non-lawyers may find that a bit tricky. We can go to Brenda Hale's lecture and have that translated. But no, they were duffed up by the Metropolitan Police. And in particular, how about this? Something's changed and something's changed not nearly enough. In particular, undercover police officers dressed as hunger marchers, right? And they behaved in a violent way in order to justify a more violent police response. That happened in 1934. Now, you don't need me to join the dots, I think, too much, because I see some nodding heads around this theatre, but you will recall some of the scandals that have emerged even in recent years, right? The scandals of the undercover police officers who went into the environmental movement, right? Who formed intimate relationships with peaceful dissenters, with women, sometimes formed quasi-marital relationships, had children with them over periods of up to 7 years because they were domestic extremists, right? About as dangerous as the, anyway, you take my point. And that happened completely unregulated by law in any sense that we could understand. And you'll also have heard the scandal of my friend Doreen Lawrence, now the Baroness Lawrence of Clarendon, who has, after 20 plus years of pain and struggle and doing something really quite phenomenal for a human rights campaigner, to take personal grief of that kind, the untimely death of a child, I can't even imagine, the untimely death of a child and at the hands of racist murderers, and to find out that the police didn't properly investigate, and that was racism, and to convert that pain into perhaps the greatest campaign for race equality that this country's ever seen. And she's a great woman, and she's a stoic and brave and wise woman who now is rightly in the House of Lords. And she finds out even earlier this year that when the police weren't investigating her son's killers, They were undercover and investigating her instead. Why? Because she was campaigning for justice and she was causing embarrassment to the Metropolitan Police. So 1934, 2014, 2 years, completely different, right? And perhaps I should be out of a job and we don't need human rights and we don't need liberty anymore. Or perhaps we do. So, as we've heard, I came to Liberty the day before 9/11, and I was asked to do blue sky thinking about what the challenges would be and about what the big campaigns ought to be in the years that were to follow. And I had about 1 day of blue sky thinking. And then the skies were no longer blue. And it was a terrible atrocity that happened in Manhattan that day. But in my view, and it is one of the sort of subtexts of the book, I think that some of the responses by great old democracies like the United Kingdom and the United States governments were counterproductive and plain wrong. And it is an argument in this book that we do not achieve greater safety by undermining the very rights and freedoms that are central to democracy and that frankly distinguish democrats on the one hand from terrorists and tyrants on the other. That is the argument. And if you think about it, not even from a sort of high-flown, liberal human rights perspective, but just in pragmatic and practical terms, which are the jurisdictions on this planet that seem to breed terrorists? Is it Scandinavia? Well, yeah, there was one. And look at the actually quite enlightened response that we saw in Norway to those terrible killings that everyone thought were jihadi killings and turned out to be a right-wing extremist. Do you remember back in 2011? No, a lot more of the world's terrorists have actually been bred in very, very repressive jurisdictions. And it is one of the arguments in this book, apart from saying we should save the Human Rights Act, we should save principles of international solidarity between human beings. It is an argument that there isn't a simple trade-off between your liberty and your security. But there have been some particular themes in that period of time between 9/11 and today, particular trends that perhaps were, if not started by 9/11 and the Bush and Blair response, but sort of catalysed by that moment. And I think one very obvious trend is the demise of our personal privacy as a fundamental value, not just a sort of legal concept, but as a human experience and as a human value. Because in the end, human rights are values. They're not just a box of lawyers' tricks to use in the courtroom to get your client off. They have to live, in my view, in the classroom and the living room and the newsroom and the boardroom and the Parliament chamber if they are to survive as the flavour of our society, as human values. And I think a lot has happened to undermine our personal privacy over more than a decade now. I think that technology is a challenge. Of course it is. There is a lot of very cool technology. We love our smartphones that can tell us where the next pizza is coming from, but can also tell other people where we went and had the pizza and quite possibly who with. And if we find it cool and convenient and attractive technology, so do other people. And the ease with which data can be scooped up and collected and stored and browsed and searched, not just by us, but by the authorities and indeed by cyber criminals, that has moved apace. And it's my concern that the culture and the debate and the ethics and the politics and the law has not kept up with the pace of technological change. And one of the most important things I think that university environments can do is to bring people of different disciplines together so that the technologists and the innovators and the inventors on the one hand can have important collaborative dialogue with lawyers and those who study the humanities and who study the arts and who study history and have a sense of how great technologies can be used to good or ill by accident or by design. Now, our personal privacy is protected in law for the first time in this country by Article 8 of the Human Rights Convention, now in our Human Rights Act. And it's my argument that it is inherent to human dignity that we have just a little bit of respect for that private space that we all seem to instinctively yearn for. I argue that these are human values, but they're also essential to democracy itself. Imagine if you had no civil and political rights protected by law. We just have the wonderful fairy tale at the heart of our constitution that they call parliamentary sovereignty. I love fairy tales, by the way, but you take my point. So we have a game of winner takes all. We just have general elections every 4 or 5 years, and then whoever wins the election or is capable of cobbling together a coalition, they can do whatever they like with their armies of loyal backbenchers and whips and the payroll vote that seems to get bigger every few years, and they can then do what they like. And now you're really going to have to work with me now, because this is a leap for the imagination. I am the great charismatic new Prime Minister with a popular majority. It's not Monsieur Farage, it's me. Okay? And it's all completely consensual. I've done incredibly well. I've, taken the country by storm and am, legitimately and popularly elected. And then I decide that those critics of mine in the newspapers that call me the most dangerous woman in Britain and all that other seditious stuff, they really are being quite treacherous and disloyal and contrary to the public interest, and perhaps they ought to be censored a little bit. And ditto my political opponents, some of whom have behaved in a very suspect way with their expenses and so on, and they really ought to be subject to closer criminal investigation and detention, sometimes for lengthy periods before they're charged or tried. And perhaps we should have politicians running the police service. Perhaps we should have police and crime commissioners. You take my point. And so it goes on. And ultimately, I take the view that the time of great economic uncertainty and austerity, general elections are really rather expensive. And perhaps we just need to, we just need to postpone the general election just for a year or two until we can really afford to spend the considerable millions that it costs to administer these elections properly. Yeah? And I can do all of this with my great big popular majority and parliamentary sovereignty and so on. And guess what? Something that started as democracy is descending into something quite different, because we don't have some rules of the game policed by independent referees that we call judges. Because we have developed a political culture where the politicians think they are the only people with legitimate power in our society. No rules of the game, no referees of the game. And this has happened in my lifetime and yours elsewhere in the world. Not here, but it has happened elsewhere in the world, where freedom fighters who come in the post-colonial moments with a great big popular majority start changing their behaviour in a way that is slightly less freedom-loving. And I think perhaps sometimes we're a little too complacent. Now privacy is a tricky one, because, as I say, I believe that it's inherent that we, very, very early on in our lives, we want to close the bathroom door or the bedroom door, or, just have a little bit of personal space to which we retreat. That seems to be inherent in humanity. But equally, we're social creatures. Human rights have to reflect humanity. We are social creatures. We're not, no one's an island. And the moment we rub along together in families and friendship circles and in the workplace and in communities and in democratic society, we have to give up a little bit of that autonomy and that privacy. It's a negotiation. It is a balance. And of course, it is important to have lawful surveillance if you are going to investigate and prevent crime and so on. And if you want to have a proper tax system and a health system and so on, you cannot have absolute privacy. I understand that. And yet, how do you have fair elections without a secret ballot? How do you have fair trials without confidential counsel from your lawyers? How do you have freedom of thought, conscience, and religion if you can't have a bit of reflection in the private space? And even though you'll know that privacy and free speech are often set against each other, particularly by tabloid newspapers that, you know, want to do kiss and tell stories all the time, ask a journalist to compromise their sources and they'll tell you that journalistic confidentiality is essential to free speech. And look at the way that some people throughout history, before the internet, have been much freer and braver and safer to express their political and other opinions under the cloak of anonymity. So here's the thing, it is what we call a balanced right. It can't be absolute. There must be necessary and proportionate intrusion with privacy, and it should, in my view, be subject to greater legal protection, but it can't be absolute. And yet, imagine a world or a society without it. That is a society with no intimacy, no dignity, and no trust between human beings. And that is what I worry about, both because of the technological possibilities for intrusion and because of the great, and I'm afraid quite defensive and sometimes arrogant rise of the security state over the last decade. Now, I know I'm being controversial here. I know there are two sides to this argument, and the other side of the argument goes, nothing to hide, nothing to fear, right? You've heard that since 9/11. Surely the innocent have nothing to fear from blanket surveillance of your email traffic and which websites you visited and who you were communicating with by phone and where you were, because your phone will also reveal your location data. And so nothing to hide, nothing to fear. You're not behaving like a criminal, are you? So it's fine. That kind of knowledge that actually sets up a very, very intimate picture of your life is not going to compromise you if you're not doing anything wrong. Blanket surveillance, what's the problem? Well, say that to my friend Doreen Lawrence. And let me put it this way. I know that bad things happen online. I know that people can conspire towards terrorism or, you know, or get involved in child pornography or do all sorts of other illegal and immoral things facilitated by the internet. And I know that it can't and mustn't be a completely ungoverned space, unregulated, you know, like Somalia or somewhere. There has to, you know, what is unlawful in the real world is unlawful in the virtual world. I completely accept that. But, you know, bad things happen in the real world too. And if you think about it, every dwelling, every domestic dwelling that stands for more than a few years will be a crime scene. I guarantee that any Victorian house anywhere in this country has been a crime scene. Think about it in terms of, you know, minor common assaults, sex offences, and even worse have happened in people's dwellings. Right? You take the view, nothing to hide, nothing to fear. Why don't we just change the legal and physical architecture of this country? And with digital recording, we have that possibility now. Why don't we just change the legal and physical architecture of this country so that in every home there are microphones and cameras? But don't worry, we're not going to listen to the stuff or watch it. We're just going to collect it. And then after the fact, if somebody makes a complaint, somebody suspects that there was criminality in that home, it could be a burglary, it could be domestic violence, it could be a sex offence, only then will the authorities look at what happened in your home. So just relax about the cameras and the microphones in your living room. And are you comfortable with that? Are you? Maybe some of you are. Completely comfortable with that. It's not going to change your behaviour, is it? It's not going to make you feel strange and unprotected in your home. You're not going to worry about any abuses of power and intrusion, are you? Well, I don't know what you think about that, but I say if you are uncomfortable with it, think about your online life as well. Because some younger people that I talk to up and down this country live more intimately online than they do even in their bedrooms. You know, their bedrooms, what have you got? Tracy Emin's bed is a work of art, fantastic. But online, you've got people's intimate relationships, who they're talking to, what they're thinking about, their health, their sexuality, their politics, just developing. And we're going to scoop all that up. And do you know what? The Edward Snowden revelations and what follows have demonstrated really quite recently that this isn't just a debate about what is proportionate and where to draw the line, because I accept where each of us probably going to take a slightly different view on where exactly the balance should be struck. What troubles me most about the way in which our privacy has been undermined in recent years is it was happening completely outside the law. Right? Bills were dropped in Parliament, both by the new Labour governments and then more recently by the coalition. They called them the communications data, blah, blah, blah. We call them the Snoopers Charter. This legislation was dropped every so often because it was controversial. And then we find out, thanks to Edward Snowden, the American whistleblower, they were doing it anyway. So there's your fairy tale called parliamentary sovereignty. They were doing it outside the democratic process. They were doing it outside the rule of law. And that, I think, is what I find most chilling of all in the way in which the debate and the practice around our privacy has been undermined. I suppose one could have predicted it. And another thing that one could have predicted post 9/11 is the undermining of fair trials. Now, those of us who are old enough to remember know that internment and diploc courts and so on and so forth has been a feature of anti-terror practice in these islands before. And in my view was discredited and proved to be counterproductive often in the context of the Troubles. But sometimes we don't learn the lessons of history. So one could have predicted that there would be an undermining of fair trial rights, and that prediction came to fruition. And you'll know that post 9/11, President Bush interned people in Guantanamo Bay, first in cages and then in more permanent structures, and there were orange jumpsuits and military commissions and so on and so forth. And though many of us looked at the first Black American president, who was a constitutional lawyer and a community organizer before he got that top job, many of us looked very expectantly and optimistically at his promises to shut down Guantanamo Bay, and we're still waiting. Right? Oldest unbroken democracy on earth, arguably, because women got the vote first, certainly up there with the United Kingdom. A great old democracy with a constitutional culture, and not just the parliamentary sovereignty fiction, you know, written constitution, founding fathers, Bill of Rights and all that, and complete suspension of habeas corpus. Why was that possible? Two reasons. The first is that there is an argument that the US Bill of Rights only protects American citizens and not human beings. This is worth remembering, I think, ladies and gentlemen, when politicians tell you that we should scrap the Human Rights Act and replace it with a British Bill of Rights and Responsibilities for citizens, remembering that your citizenship can be taken away from you, though some of us argue that your humanity cannot. So that was part of the argument that clever White House lawyers had for Guantanamo Bay. It's okay because they're foreigners. And then the other argument is it's offshore. Right? It's the torture chamber, the place of detention. It's not happening here. It's over there. And, you know, it's Cuba. We know about Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, because we saw that movie with Tom Cruise and Jack Nicholson. Do you remember? I eat my breakfast. You know the anyway. So that was possible over there. And what happened in Britain was initially internment in Belmarsh Prison in South London. How was it possible? Because it was called immigration detention, again for foreign nationals, even though they weren't being sent anywhere. That's what happened first, until our law lords, including Baroness Hale, who's giving a far more scintillating talk down the road, before they said, using the Human Rights Act, no, you can't do that. And why can't you do it? Because it's disproportionate and discriminatory, because British nationals are just as capable of being mixed up in terrorism as foreign nationals. And you know, the law lords were right, because within a year of their judgment, that was in December 2004, in fact, within 6 months of their judgment, what had happened? July 2005, London bombings, perpetrators, British nationals. So, you know, this idea that it's all just foreigners isn't right in principle and isn't right in practice. And post the Great Law Lords judgment in the Belmarsh case, we saw the replacement of internment in Belmarsh prison with control orders, house arrest instead, applied this time to British nationals as well as foreign nationals. And then the coalition government rebranded control orders. I mean, this is sort of effective house arrest without charge or trial, not for 90 days or 42 days, but potentially indefinitely in this country, in the land of Magna Carta. And you watch next spring, when all our great senior politicians go to various parties and celebrations for Magna Carta. Do you remember what Tony Hancock said about Magna Carta? Did she die in vain? So we saw predictably the undermining of fair trial rights in the land of habeas corpus and Magna Carta in freedom's name. And maybe one could have predicted that. But I have to be honest, the one thing I would never have predicted, even in my blue sky thinking days in the autumn of 2001, having come from the Home Office to be to work at Liberty, the one thing I would never have predicted actually was the flirtation with torture by the US and UK authorities. I wouldn't have predicted that. I don't know if you would. I loved my work. It is the greatest privilege to be able to talk about the importance of rights and freedoms, to work with a brilliant bunch of predominantly young colleagues at Liberty House in Westminster, people I would choose to spend time with if I weren't paid to spend time with them. It is a great privilege to not just have to complain about the state of the nation in the pub with a glass in my hand, though I do that too. But to sometimes have a microphone in my hand, and it's been amazing. And the young Shami would never have predicted that I would have had such a fortunate career, but nor would she have predicted that I would have to regularly stand up in the broadcast media and in lecture theatres like this and make arguments against torture. And that's what I've had to do for some years now. And that I wouldn't have predicted. Extraordinary rendition, ladies and gentlemen, was not sweet singing, and waterboarding was not a seaside sport. And that's an interesting trend in itself, isn't it? The abuse of language. You know, people, if you're in my job, if you ever get my job, by the way, one bit of advice is that there are some adjectives not to use, because people turn off immediately. So one is Kafkaesque, and another one is Orwellian. No. So I'm always trying to avoid saying Kafkaesque or Orwellian, and I find these other euphemisms like chilling. And I was saying chilling a little, I said chilling a little too much, and some clever dick on the internet said, oh, that Chakrabarti, she's been going on about chilling again. That woman sees refrigerators everywhere. Clever dick on the internet. But for me, Orwellian isn't just about Big Brother and blanket surveillance. Orwellian to me is his famous essay, The Politics of the English Language. If anybody knows that essay, that to me is Orwell at his best, because what he describes there is the way that the abuse of language leads to the contortion of values and ideas and ultimately the abuse of people. And that's what I feel about euphemisms like extraordinary rendition and waterboarding. Extraordinary rendition is kidnap and torture. Waterboarding is drowning a suspect to extract what you want from them. And I would not have predicted that the US and the UK authorities would get involved in that, even by contracting it out to darker dictatorial places from which terrorism is bred. But that happened in our name, in freedom's name, over the last decade and a bit longer. And another theme that I touch on in the book is the law of unintended consequences. Because a lot of these things I've tried to suggest to you become acceptable because they're going to happen to other people, right? So Belmarsh, Guantanamo, it's foreigners, it's going to be all right. Don't worry. We have to do this. They are the bad guys. There's a war on terror. That's another brilliant Orwellian phrase, isn't it? Let's be at war with an abstract noun. No, I'm not trying to get a giggle because there isn't terrorism, but I'm just saying it's been part of the human experience and it's been a device. You know, political murder and violence has been part of the human experience forever and probably always will be. And if we're in the war against that practice, that war goes on forever. And you appreciate my concern about that. Because, of course, wars can be indefinite in the moment. So in World War II, during the Blitz, the citizens of this country didn't know when the war was going to end. Of course not. When the bombs go, you just don't know. However, they did know that they would be able to verify the end of the war with their own senses. And bad thing, you know, there was internment in World War II. There were ID cards in World War II. And, you know, Winston Churchill went to the House of Commons and, you know, argued for ID cards, but did it with a heavy heart and said, you know, I long for the day when I will come back to this Parliament and hand these powers back. So there were, you know, there was rationing, there were curfews, all of that. But at least people knew that when the war was over, the bombs would stop, or a peace treaty would be signed, they would be able to verify the end of the war with their own senses. They wouldn't have to wait for a, you know, a George Bush the 23rd or a, you know, Tony Blair the 15th or a Hillary Clinton to go, just one more push, guys, and the war on terror will be over. And that's what concerns me, because you see, a permanent state of emergency is a contradiction in terms, isn't it? An emergency without end. It might be a terrible time and bad things, but if it's permanent, how can it be an emergency? It's just a new way of living, and it's a way of living without our rights and freedoms and without the open society that makes our life worth living. That's my argument. And we give up all these freedoms so casually because we have lived in relative freedom in the UK for so long, and we never think it's going to affect us. And there's a chapter in my book called The Law of Unintended Consequences where I talk about things like stop and search without suspicion. Whole counties of this country that were declared in secret as stop and search zones with no requirement on the part of the police for reasonable suspicion. Declared in secret by chief constables and signed off in secret by the Home Secretary. No parliamentary approval, no judicial warrantry, that just happened. And how many terrorists were caught that way? None. But instead, again, peace protesters and young black and Asian men in the cities in particular, completely alienated when they need to be recruited to law enforcement in the interests of society. And extradition, summary extradition, our treaty arrangement, our lopsided treaty with the United States, the European arrest warrant that's been causing such consternation in Parliament just this week. Don't get me wrong, we have to have extradition. You shouldn't be able to flee across a border if you've done something terrible, but there have to be some safeguards before you're just carted around the world. Because even if you're going to get a fantastic trial at the other end, a fair trial, to be taken from your home and your family and your language and your legal system, to be detained pending trial for a couple of years in another part of the world, that's punishment in itself. And even if you're acquitted at the end of it, your life has been ruined. You've lost your job. You know, elderly parents have died, children have grown up, and you're on the other side of the world banged up. And those arrangements were passed, and our government signed those deals because it wasn't going to be us. It wasn't going to be anybody in this room. It was going to be jihadi terror suspects. That's the deal. And then it ends up being Gary McKinnon, right? The vulnerable man with Asperger's syndrome. Do you remember him? So he's on the autism spectrum, but he's very good at computers. And he goes looking for UFOs online, and he manages to hack into the Pentagon computer. Don't ask me how. I can't use my iPhone, right? And instead of offering him a job in cybersecurity, the Pentagon declare him a terrorist, etc., etc. He spends 10 years fighting extradition to the US when he would have pleaded guilty to computer misuse here in the UK. Christopher Tappin, the pillar of his local community and I think Conservative Association and golf club in Orpington, ran an import-export business, never left his office. Import and export online again, and he is accused of arming Iran because he's providing freight for some batteries that are going from the UK to Holland, and the US authorities say, but those batteries are going onwards from Holland and they're going to be used in the Iranian nuclear program, right? So he ends up in a Texas prison with no basic case to answer ever shown in a local magistrate's court in the UK. Just off you go. Do not pass go, do not collect £500, go to a Texas prison. And he was understandably upset. My colleagues campaigned on his behalf, and from the tarmac at Heathrow Airport, he said, it's disgusting that I am now going under this treaty, and Abu Qatada, see, I can't give a talk without mentioning Mr. Qatada. The French say that a meal without wine is like a day without sunshine. For me, it's a talk without Abu Qatada. He's like a sort of stalker ex-boyfriend that's followed me up and down this country. No, but Christopher Tappin said, I'm off to Texas by summary extradition, and Abu Qatada's not yet been sent to Jordan. And he's the terror suspect. And that was put to me very kindly and helpfully on a radio phone-in programme the day of Tappin's extradition. And I said, well, I do feel for Mr. Tappin. I don't think he should be extradited without a case shown in a local court. But he must understand, too, that out in Texas, where he is a foreigner, he's British, he's not American. You know how the baddies in American movies always have English accents, right? So out in Texas, where he's accused of arming Iran, he looks just a little bit like Abu Qatada, right? And that's a really, really important point, I think, with which I want to end before we go to questions. To just have the imagination to see ourselves through other people's eyes, particularly when we are suspect and when we are foreign. And that's ultimately the argument for keeping human rights rather than citizens' privileges. I believe that this is a shrinking, interconnected planet, shrinking by the minute, not just by travel, not just by global challenges, but by things like the internet. And we have a choice to make. Do you want to be protected as a citizen of one little tiny area of the globe, or do you want some very basic human rights protections as a human being everywhere? That's the choice. Human being everywhere or foreigner in most parts of the world. And I'm not asking for the right to a decaffeinated latte. I'm asking for no torture and free speech and fair trials and respect for my personal privacy and freedom of thought, conscience and religion. And perhaps most importantly of all, equal treatment under the law. And why is that the most important of all? Because it's walking around in other people's shoes. And if we really respected the value of equal treatment, lawyers call it equal treatment and humans call it empathy. If we really had that empathy, then we wouldn't have the other violations on torture and slavery and so on, would we? Brenda Hale is a great jurist who's speaking on campus this evening, but another great jurist was Tom Bingham, Lord Bingham. And he spoke to Liberty's 75th anniversary conference 5 years ago. He spoke far more eloquently than I ever will, and he set out the rights and freedoms as I've attempted to do. And he ended like this, you know, with the no torture, the free speech, the fair trials, the freedom of conscience, and so on. He said, in closing, which of these rights, I ask, would we wish to discard? Are any of them trivial, superfluous, unnecessary? Are any of them un-British. There may be those who'd like to live in a country where these rights are not protected, but I'm not of their number. Nor am I. Thanks for listening.